Hey, this is Max from UNFTR in New York, reporting for the MeidasTouch network. It might not seem like it, but this week is already shaping up to be a huge one in financial news. And none of it is good for the president, which means certainly none of it is good for the U.S. consumer. Now, toward the end of this report, I'm going to show you something mind-blowing that's just below the surface of all the data and above the pay grade of the brain trust in the White House. It's one of those things that makes you go, uh-oh, and helps you grasp the severity of the looming U.S. economic crisis. Now, before we dig into the numbers, let's put these releases into context of world events right now, because you always have to sift through the bluster and chaos of this administration to find out what they're deflecting. Fresh off his trip defending Russia's interests with other world leaders at the G7, and only days after sleeping through his big boy military birthday parade, the president is back in D.C. to kick up dust on Truth Social and keep everyone distracted from the ghouls in the Senate so they can finish their work gutting the U.S. economy and destroying the U.S. consumer. Of course, he couldn't help but be petty on his way out of the G7, taking time on Truth Social to smack Macron around, saying he didn't leave the summit to make a ceasefire deal, so Macron's just wrong. Now, not for nothing. I know we're all used to the child-in-chief kind of smacking people around online, but for the love of God, hasn't Emmanuel Macron been through enough lately? Now, beyond this ridiculousness and the chaos that he always sows, what's not a laughing matter is the escalating tensions between Israel and Iran. After an unprovoked attack on Tehran, Iran is now striking back at Israel and even breaking through their vaunted missile defense systems. There are reportedly more than 200 already dead in Tehran and 24 in Israel as the United States draws ever closer to potentially participating. This was, of course, the pretense for Trump jumping ship from the G7 talks, where he finally had a seat at the big boy table. Further negotiations with our leading allies and trade partners in the world will have to apparently wait. Now, a good rule of thumb, whenever there are military operations grabbing the headlines, is to look at which ones are being suppressed. And in this case, we have an interesting stream of economic news coming out of various agencies ahead of Fed Chair Jerome Powell's remarks tomorrow. The first release this morning was worse than expected retail and food sales for May, which were down 0.9% from the previous month. Spending had peaked in March ahead of Trump's much ballyhooed Liberation Day in April, which sent panic through the global financial markets and started a sell-off of U.S. financial assets, which I'll come back to in a little bit. So the biggest soft spot in the data was in the auto sector, with Americans beginning to back off automobile purchases. Now, it's important to note that prices haven't even really started to jump due to the Trump tariffs, so this isn't welcome news in one of the leading U.S. manufacturing sectors, as it stands to only worsen as the year progresses. Import-export figures were also released for May, with prices for non-fuel imports advancing 0.3% in May on top of an increase of 0.4% in April. So higher prices for industrial supplies led the way, which offset decreases in food and beverage. So with the dollar continuing to trade below average and imports on industrial materials increasing, we're months, if not several weeks away from these inputs really showing up in inflation data. Now, it's one of the reasons that the Fed is in such a pickle right now, because all leading indicators are showing that inputs are increasing. With certain major retailers already admitting to price hikes on consumer goods, it's more tough news for the Trump administration as trade talks stagnate abroad. So I don't know, maybe stay in Canada a few extra days and try to make nice with our allies. So compounding the inflation on imports was a decrease in prices for U.S. exports of 0.9% in May. That's the largest single month decline since 2023. So this means we're paying more for what's coming in and getting paid less for what's going out. It's a tough road ahead for U.S. manufacturing if raw materials and industrial goods are increasing in price and we're getting less on finished goods and other U.S. manufacturing exports. And the reason these are important is because we're starting to see the real economy show up in the data after being perverted by the tariff announcements, with consumers, retailers, wholesalers, and suppliers all loading up on inventory earlier in the year as they braced for the tariff storm. So on balance, all of the hard industrial and retail data was worse than economists hoped and predicted. So now if we head over to housing, there's an even bigger storm brewing. It's important to note that the initial data that comes out in the beginning of the month is survey data, which is basically the equivalent of polling. So it tends to be anecdotal ahead of the hard numbers that come out later in the month. But it's a bleak picture, as the recent HMI survey shows that 37% of home builders reported cutting prices in June. That's the largest percentage since the numbers have been tracked. Now, that would be good news if people could afford to get a mortgage these days, but with spiraling consumer debt and stubbornly high mortgage rates, we're stuck in a housing doom loop. The average price reduction in June was 5%, which is a continuation of a trend that started in November of last year, even with a 62% increase in sales incentives. This is sentiment data, again, so we're going to get more information out shortly, but housing is shaping up to be a significant headwind story for the U.S. economy. This has many beginning to compare and contrast the housing market in 2017, which started to crack prior to the collapse. And there are pockets of the U.S. that are already seeing dramatic reversals in housing prices, skyrocketing inventories, and houses staying on the market longer. Cities like Austin, Texas, Phoenix, Arizona, large parts of Florida are experiencing an exodus due to an affordability and housing shortage crisis that is spreading rapidly across the United States, especially in parts of the country that saw populations balloon during COVID. So you'll see pictures beginning to emerge of a U.S. consumer that is stretched to the max. I mean, mortgage balances on consumer credit reports grew by $199 billion during the first quarter of this year and totaled $12.8 trillion at the end of March. HELOC balances also rose by $6 billion. That's the 12th consecutive quarterly increase. So now there's $402 billion in outstanding HELOC balances. Consumers basically are looking everywhere for liquidity. And that's just the segment of the population fortunate enough to own a home and have equity in it. As much as Trump wants to excoriate the Fed for not dropping rates, on the stuff that matters to consumers, this is actually a Trump problem rather than a Fed problem. See, mortgage rates are tied to the 10-year Treasury note, not the federal funds rate, although there's definitely some overlap. So as you can see from the Redfin data, the average mortgage rate is still around 6.8%. Average home prices are creeping higher, but the absolute sales are down. This is the calm before the storm, because the 10-year Treasury is influenced by the tariff war, the Moody's credit downgrade on U.S. credit, and the sell-off of U.S. debt because the world is losing confidence in our leadership and our ability to manage the economy. So there's literally nothing on the horizon to save housing data. And these aren't the big headline numbers that get all the attention in the media, mind you. And the prospect of the U.S. being dragged into a completely preventable war between Israel and Iran, the real economy tends to take a back seat to the attention economy. What they really want you to divert your eyes from, of course, is the Senate Finance Committee's response to the House version of the Big Beautiful Bill Act.
And Republicans on the Senate Finance Committee are unveiling proposed changes to President Trump's so-called Big Beautiful Bill. Those changes to Medicaid, tax cuts, and the debt limit could set up a potential clash with House Republicans.
The impact on low-income households, and especially in red states, which makes it even nuttier that they're doing this, is even worse than the original print of the bill and spells disaster for the economy. The newly released Senate bill takes an even bigger swing at Medicaid that would have far-reaching consequences for low-income Americans. And unlike the House version, this Senate proposal implements even deeper cuts to Medicaid funding, using these savings to help preserve clean energy tax credits. And that sounds lovely until you realize that this is the part that benefits people like Elon Musk specifically. So don't think for a moment that they're doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. There's also an absurd amount of Wall Street investment money pegged to those tax credits. So in terms of Medicaid, the most significant change in the bill involves expanded work requirements beyond what the House had proposed. So the House bill was requiring childless adults to work or volunteer at least 80 hours a month to maintain Medicaid eligibility. That in and of itself is a complete administrative nightmare for the states, which will cost them more money, but we'll come back to that in a sec. Now, the Senate version extends this requirement to parents with children over the age of 14. This expansion significantly broadens the number of people who could potentially lose their health care coverage if they're unable to meet the work requirements. The bill also restricts states' ability to finance their Medicaid programs by imposing tighter regulations on how they can tax healthcare providers and use those funds for Medicaid reimbursements. So combined with reduced federal funding for states that expanded Medicaid, these changes create a perfect storm of financial pressures on state healthcare systems, which will blow back on the average American. The CBO projects that these combined measures could result in up to 11 million more Americans becoming uninsured by 2034. Families with teenage children face particular risk under the new work requirements for parents. Meanwhile, states will be forced to make difficult decisions between cutting healthcare services, reducing payments to hospitals, and scrambling to find new revenue sources that they basically just capped them and prevented them from finding. But now for the big uh-oh that I promised you. The reason the GOP is looking for ways to reduce spending is because the portion of the budget that goes toward interest on our debt is nearly $1 trillion in the proposed budget. Now, this is what has led to the global flight to safety assets like gold and even some speculative assets like Bitcoin, along with a flight to foreign treasuries and asset classes. There is a massive shift underway in the global economy right now because central banks, investment banks, sovereign wealth funds, pensions, pretty much any large pool of investment capital is flowing out of the United States. Now, the way the U.S. tracks this is through something called TIC data. This stands for Treasury International Capital, and it measures how much money is leaving the U.S. versus how much is coming in. So every day, trillions of dollars moves through the global economy, and central banks like the Fed make decisions based upon certain inputs and trends. And this will illustrate why Fed policy is more difficult than Trump is suggesting. No amount of breathing down Jerome Powell's neck is going to fix the reputational damage the president and the GOP have done to the U.S. economy in such a short period of time. As the saying goes, the markets take the stairs up and the escalator down. So this is the most recent TIC release, and the next one is scheduled later this week. So if you're wondering what the big guys are looking at, this is it. And this is just a small snapshot of the purchases they track. So the securities you see here are broken down by Treasury bonds and notes, government agency bonds, corporate bonds, and U.S. equities. If you look at Treasury bonds, government agency bonds, and U.S. equities from February to March, you can begin to see a sell-off of U.S. assets. So basically a decline from month to month as foreign investors started moving money around and trimming U.S. assets. But look at the corporate bonds figure during the same time period. Throughout all of 2024, there was a net purchase surplus of U.S. bonds of $262 billion, which is roughly $21 billion per month. And that lines up pretty well with the activity that we see in December of 24 and January of 25. Then there was a sell-off in February before the figure rockets back in March to hit an all-time high. So here's the translation, and it's mind-blowing. Right at the moment that the world started trimming U.S. treasuries, trimming U.S. equities and agency bonds, and the entire world was predicting a global recession in 2025, led by the United States and Trump's tariff war, foreign investors suddenly decided that U.S. corporate debt was the best bet? No. See, we know from the Panama Papers that there's about $11 trillion being held offshore by global corporations and wealthy individuals. And of that amount, it's estimated that $4 trillion worth is from the United States. Moreover, a 2018 study found that 73% of Fortune 500 companies operated subsidiaries in these tax haven countries. So the upshot of what the TIC data reveal is that there is a liquidity crisis brewing inside the United States because Trump's tariff war and overall chaos and mismanagement of the economy is forcing investors to flee to foreign assets. So much so that U.S. corporations have to revert to purchasing their own bonds from their offshore accounts. This is a self-dealing Ponzi scheme that can only go on for so long. The longer this outflow continues, the more the GOP digs into the wallets of average Americans, the average American who's already underwater with debt, the more goods cost inside of the U.S. and the less we get paid for goods heading out of the U.S., the more obvious it becomes that we are wholly unprepared for the catastrophe that this administration is creating. Now, I want to reinforce something that I dropped in there pretty casually. Large U.S. corporations and wealthy individuals are hiding so much money offshore, they're running their own shadow debt economy. And yet the GOP is cutting IRS agents who would otherwise be going after this money. They're chopping up Medicaid to effectively end Obamacare, contributing to inflation with this ridiculous tariff war, and forcing the global investment community to flee from U.S. assets, thereby generating a liquidity crisis. I mean, no wonder he was so excited about the war in Iran. Just look away, folks. There's nothing to see here. For the MeidasTouch Network, I'm Max from UNFTR. For deeper dives into socioeconomic and economic news, check out our YouTube channel at UNFTR, or head to UNFTR.com where you can sign up for our free weekly newsletter. And I'll see you in the next one.
The truth is more important than ever. Check out our new Truth Over Lies collection at store.MeidasTouch.com. All 100% USA union made.